Hello, this is Pastor Rick, and I want to welcome you to our bonus Bible study on this Thursday, May the 6th. And we'll be talking about a fascinating theme that runs through all of Scripture on this Thursday, but one that's unfamiliar to many of us. We're going to be talking about the way of the exile, the way of the exile. Again, this bonus Bible study is meant so that our people here at Emmanuel will read the Bible better and that we will build a Bible culture here at Emmanuel Lutheran Church. Now, this theme of the way of the exile is actually a quite contemporary theme. Immigrants really focus on this because often they come to the United States and they want to prosper here, but their intention is to take that prosperity and at some point in their life go back home. And that's the idea of an exile, is someone who's trying to prosper, but finally don't feel at home where they live. They're going to at some point go back home. So it's important for immigrants, but I have found in the evangelical community and with conservative Roman Catholics, they often use this metaphor of living in exile because they're not happy now with the value systems and the social commitments of the United States. So they don't feel like they're living at home, so to speak. They feel like they're living in exile. And so this has become a huge theme in many churches to talk about how do you live committed to the place where you live, committed to the city and its prosperity, and at the same time not embrace those values that surround you. So again, that idea is living in exile. Now, we're going to be talking about this original exile, the one that's usually focused on the Bible, after the Babylonian captivity, when the Babylonians came and destroyed Jerusalem in 587 BC. And it scattered Jews throughout the ancient world, but many then were taken as slaves back to Babylon. And then the question is, okay, how do they live? Right? Do they live and are they loyal to the Babylonians, which might mean they compromise their value systems? In other words, do they fight the power? Do they protest, even if in subtle ways? Or do they give in and become part of the Babylonian culture? That's all this dynamic that we pick up in Scripture. And you remember some of the most famous Jews at that time who were living in Babylon. And we know them because these were our favorite Sunday school stories of Daniel. Remember Daniel in the lion's den, where here Daniel is working in the royal palace. He's quite loyal to Nebuchadnezzar, but when he stands up for God, when he will not worship Nebuchadnezzar as God, he is thrown into the lion's den. And there God shuts the mouth of the lions. I remember that from Sunday school class. Pretty dramatic, those pictures of Daniel with all those lions roaming around. The same moral of the story was with Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. I mean, who could forget those names? And again, they were put in the fiery furnace for the same purpose. They would not bow down to Nebuchadnezzar. They would not worship him as their God, as the divine presence, as was demanded in Babylon. And so they are sent into the fiery furnace. Remember those pictures where a fourth person, an angel, comes and sits next to them and saves them, again reinforcing this important lesson in exile, that you got to stand up for your commitments. In this case, you're standing up for the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. Now, again, we're just setting up this film today, The Way of the Exile, but I'm adding some things that they don't mention here. And one of the keys, building on the Ethiopian eunuch, that theme of being a eunuch, is that Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego were eunuchs. That means they were castrated. What happened was the Babylonians come to Jerusalem, they destroy the city, they lay the temple waste, they take these people then, the Jews from Jerusalem, take them into their slave. And anytime you would bring a servant into the palace to work at the highest levels of government to being official or working personally for Nebuchadnezzar or in his harem, you would castrate the men. So you would really brutalize them in order to make a more docile, a more loyal servant out of them. And also there'd be no dalliance, right, in the palace. And so Daniel, very educated, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, those were Babylonian names. They're all castrated as adults, brought in to serve Nebuchadnezzar. They were talented, they could read and they write. But then they were eunuchs, which meant when they heard the prophecies of Isaiah that they might be able to return to Jerusalem, they knew because of Deuteronomy 23 that we discussed this week in the sermon, that they would not be allowed to serve in any official capacity because they were castrated. That was the law of Moses in Deuteronomy 23 verse 1. And so they kind of lost hope. And they said, well, why would we want to go back to Jerusalem? Why not stay in exile? Because there's no way we can serve to rebuild the city. And that's where Isaiah chapter 56 promises them not only can they return, but they will be able to serve and have an elevated position in Jerusalem to rebuild the walls, rebuild the temple, to rebuild the city. Okay, all that eunuch stuff plays an important role in this story in exile, but is not mentioned, of course, in the video because no one ever mentions those types of details, but it plays an important role in this story. Now, what you are going to hear in this video is this idea of loyalty and subversion playing out this dynamic in each of the exiles. And so you want to notice this dynamic that Jeremiah prophesies and says that those who were taken in exile in Babylon should work for the prosperity of the city. Says, because if the city prospers, Jeremiah says, so will these exiles. So that's part of the loyalty. And you often experience that with those who experience exile. They're really committed to the prosperity of the city or the nation where they serve. But then they'll throw in the second part, loyalty and subversion. That there's a point at where Daniel, for example, will not give in, will not compromise the first commandment. He will not worship Nebuchadnezzar. And he is going to pay a price for that, and because Nebuchadnezzar sees that commitment as subversion. In fact, I'd like to say here it's more about clarity of commitment, more about clarity of purpose, what we see in Daniel and others, than subversion. But often that's what happens, right? When you're clear about your purpose in life, when you're clear about following God, that becomes subversive when someone is demanding other loyalties. Then the video takes that and brings it to the time of Jesus, saying that this Messiah, this leader who brings out loyalty and subversion, the one that Daniel prophesies will come is then fulfilled in Jesus. And so they give some examples of how Jesus is both loyal, right, to the Roman Empire this time, but also subversive at the same time. And again, I think it's more about clarity of purpose than of subversion. But here we go. Living in exile. What does that mean for you? What does that mean for me? The way of the exile, let's watch the video right now.
In the year 587 BC, the city of Jerusalem was attacked by the Babylonian Empire. And a year later, the city and the temple were plundered and burned.
Thousands of Israelites were taken from their homes and relocated all over ancient Babylon. They became exiles.
And so now they're a minority, surrounded by a new culture with new gods.
Now, some Israelites chose to resist Babylon by revolting or withdrawing. Others gave in, adopting the Babylonian way of life and accepting these new gods as their own.
And you might think those are your only two options, but the prophet Jeremiah told them to do something totally different and surprising. To settle in, build houses, plant gardens, grow families, and most surprisingly, to seek the well-being of Babylon and pray to the Lord on its behalf.
So this is like a third way.
Yeah, it's not compromise or revolt.
What does it look like?
Well, there's a whole book of the Bible that explores that question. It's the story of Daniel.
Daniel was one of the Israelites taken into the Babylonian exile.
And because Daniel had a royal heritage and education, he was recruited along with some friends to work in the high court of Babylon.
Work for the enemy? That would be compromise. Or they could gain the king's trust, take him down from the inside.
That's what you might expect, but instead, they take Jeremiah's advice and choose the third way. They serve the king of Babylon, taking on Babylonian names and even clothing style.
So they seek Babylon's well-being. But in doing so, aren't they just giving up their heritage?
It could seem that way, but actually they aren't. As you read on, the story focuses on moments where they draw the line, and they choose faithfulness to their God and resist the influence of Babylon.
So for example,
Well, like when they're commanded to bow down to the idol of Babylon and give allegiance to the king as if he's a god.
they won't go that far.
Right, this is where you see their true loyalty. It requires them to critique Babylon's idolatry of power, its arrogance, its injustice, but they do it non-violently by laying down their lives. And so God vindicates Daniel and his friends for their faithfulness.
So they would serve Babylon, seek its well-being, but their loyalty was always to God.
Yeah, this is what Jeremiah was envisioning. The way of the exile is a combination of loyalty and also subversion.
So they're still exiles, but don't Daniel and his friends long to go home?
Yes, in fact, Daniel believed that God was going to send a ruler to bring down Babylon and create a true kingdom of peace.
When did he think this ruler would come?
Well, at first he thought within his lifetime, but then he had a dream where he found out that after Babylon would come another oppressive empire, then another, then another.
And so Babylon did fall, and Israel did get to go back home, but now they're ruled by Babylon's successors.
And so they maintained the mindset of an exile, waiting for their true home to come to them. And they continued the same practice of loyalty and subversion to any new versions of Babylon that came along. And this leads us to the time of Jesus.
The empire of his day was Rome, ruled by Caesar. Now, some Israelites wanted to resist, while others gave in and adopted Roman culture and its gods.
But watch Jesus carry on the subversive loyalty of Daniel. Like when he said, it's fine to pay taxes to Caesar, give him back his coins. But then he said, don't mistake Caesar for God. God's the one who deserves your total life and allegiance.
So the way of Jesus is this same mix of loyalty and subversion.
Yeah, like he taught his followers to love and even bless their enemies. But he also got arrested for speaking out against the corrupt leaders of Jerusalem and Rome. He critiqued their idolatry of power, and it cost him his life. But God vindicated him by raising him from the dead as the true king of the nations.
The king that Daniel had hoped for.
Right. And Jesus promised that one day his kingdom would prevail.
And so until then, his followers are living in a type of exile.
Yeah, this is why the Apostle Peter calls followers of Jesus foreigners and exiles. He told them to respect the authorities of whatever place you happen to live, to honor and love all people, but then he reminds them that this isn't their true home. They're still living in Babylon.
But, well, they're not living in Babylon. Babylon doesn't exist anymore.
Or does it? In the Bible, Babylon has become a symbol that describes any human institution that demands allegiance to its idolatrous redefinitions of good and evil.
Okay, so we all live and work in Babylon. How do I seek the well-being of Babylon while my allegiance is to someone greater?
Yes, Jesus' followers are called to live in that tension between loyalty and subversion. That's the way of the exile.